Wake up, everybody. I know it's rough with the time change, but that's the way life goes. And after hearing our theme music, it's time for Sleepy Time Theater. But actually, it's time to go through a review of what we've been doing all term. We're approaching the end, and it's time for the final exam. And so let's get started and see what you need to know. So let's take a look, first of all, before we do that, some house cleaning, and that is the course evaluations this quarter for FA255. They are available online. Contact My Lane, and you can get even. So course evaluations are now available, and then we jump to the final exam. And it is as it was during our crazy time last time, if you'll recall, how nothing worked and how live television is very interesting. And so I can't really rely on telling you what happened last time. But the final exam is 1 week only, and it is March 14th through March 21st. And so it begins this week, and you should prepare accordingly, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And it is as it was in the Social Science Testing Lab, Center 456, and the exam closes on Thursday, and that is an exact deadline. That is a real deadline, because it is the end of the term, and almost everyone else will be using that testing lab. So we want to make sure and get you in early, so you do have a week to do the exam. And but there will be no makeup exams, so you make sure and get in there during that week's time and get that exam completed. Check for Saturday hours. I know they will be available. They were available during the midterm, but they are crucial during the final exam time, as I said, because there are just so many people who will be taking the exam. So it is to your benefit to prepare and go in on a Saturday. Okay. As the midterm, it is an objective exam. There will be 50 questions. It's pretty identical in format. I mean, it is identical in format to what happened during the midterm. Study guides are now available on Moodle. So we have another study guide for you. This one is a little bit different. I think you'll like this one. It's something that I think will be to your benefit. So make sure and download or check out that study guide, and it's now available on Moodle. And okay, remember, you need photo ID, and you also need a 3x5 note card, or you don't need it, but you're allowed one 3x5 note card only. The same rules apply this time as they did during the midterm. And it is so crucial, again, that you be sure and check and verify the hours of the testing lab. You do not want to be locked out, and it's your responsibility to do that. Now, a little word about the extra credit. Remember, extra credit is offered. It's extra credit, it's not required, and I've had some contact with some people about it. And it is due, that is the deadline, is March 19th, which is be a week from tomorrow. So be sure and get it to me by March 19th, and it's at 10:30. Essentially, it's during my office hours. So if I'm not there for whatever reason, if I stepped out of the office for a moment and you can't find me, either place it on my desk, or if the door is closed, slip it under the door, I'll get it. Email submissions are okay, those are fine. And remember, as I said during our orientation session, What I prefer is an attachment, a word attachment. I don't want your paper embedded in the email, but instead as an attachment. And I really don't read these things until they come in all at once. So even if you're emailing them in advance, I will not look at them and do anything with them until I have all extra credit turned in, and so nothing will happen until March 19th. If you are sending hard copy, it must be postmarked no later than March 15th. Okay, moving on. So what do you need to know? Well, this is what you need to know. We are covering everything that is for this exam, for the final exam, information beginning with the combat film and working our way through the edge of Hollywood, including film noir, film in the television age, and so forth. So let's take a look at the combat war film. The features of the genre that you should be familiar with: laws and morality are suspended. That was made quite clear. It is a switch. This is a crucial point. There is a switch from the individual to the group. In other words, it's a switch from an emphasis upon that individual, such as the Western, which is pretty much geared towards the man roughing it, the cowboy, John Wayne. And it switches to the significance of the group. And thirdly, that women are seen as an emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. The combat war film also you should be familiar with are the anti-war sentiments and post-war films. That is, during the war, as the war is being waged, Hollywood makes films that support the troops, as it were. Films that show us the heroism and so forth of soldiers in battle, and purposely ignored certain elements of war, that we've all are familiar with. It was for the home front. It was to inspire those at home. And after the war, and this is not just simply war films that occurred like Vietnam during that era, but after the war, films begin to examine some of the issues that our soldiers had to deal with, including what we now call as PTSD, which was known then as shell shock. The war films and portrayal of racial integration of armed forces, that was discussed, and I need to mention the Sergeant York formula, and which was essentially that the conscientious objector, someone who doesn't believe in war, has a reversal and becomes heroic, and the purpose of that is essentially for the home front, again, to inspire those who are waiting on the home front. So we continue with the combat and war film, and essentially what that is all about is the fundamental American philosophy or ideology that is embedded in American war films is essentially this statement: that we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. Essentially what those films were all about was saying, yeah, we may not win this war, but we're right. We are right in an ideological sense. Now, one of the major issues during the war and within this notion of the combat film was a description and analysis of the Office of War Information, the OWI. This was the role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production. There was very much a symbiotic relationship there. Hollywood purposely joined forces with the government to produce, essentially, propaganda. These films were showing and shaping public opinion. one of the interesting films that was made at the time, that is why I have that illustration there of Walt Disney's victory through air power, was this fellow's book, which was controversial at the time. And it's kind of ironic that Disney would produce this film that says, if you really want to win the war, you do it with air power. But anyway, that one is kind of the exception there. Most of the films that were made during that time essentially followed the government's waging war. Here's the Sergeant York formula, which is depicting the conversion of an objector to supporter. This was used in practically every war film that was made during the war and also following. It began to fall apart. Or I'll give you a good example. There's a film out there that nobody seems to have. It was a film that came out, and I think it was roughly about 63 or 64, maybe a little, maybe 62. It was at the beginnings when the country itself was beginning to question, what are we doing in Vietnam? And it was a small B movie called A Yank in Vietnam. It starred Marshall Thompson, the guy who was the doctor in Daktari. And he directed it as well, although as a sort of journeyman director, the film was written and produced by others. But it essentially followed that similar Sergeant York formula, that it was a question of, what are we doing here? And it was followed by, well, we're here for freedom and so forth. Although it was a very gritty film. I remember seeing that film, and only once, and it had a lasting impression. And I remember it being very gritty. It was very realistic in its depictions of the war. But as the war progressed, Hollywood changed, of course, and we began to question, why are we in Vietnam? What on earth is going on? Why are soldiers dropping? And the question is, they seem to be dropping dead for no reason. It seems to be a corrupt government. It's all of these things back and forth, back and forth. And Hollywood begins to turn its back on it, and for the most part doesn't want anything to do with it. And while in the city streets, of course, as you saw during this film series, there are riots. So John Wayne decides to produce a major studio film about Vietnam, and he produces The Green Berets. And what does he do? He falls back on the Sergeant York formula. It didn't work, unfortunately. It was seen mostly as camp then, and pretty much is camp today. All right, moving on. We got to move on. Now into the world of film noir. And a very important question: is film noir a true genre? This is a question that is still asked today. It's kind of an ironic question because everybody accepts it as a genre. But still, the question is it really truly a genre? Because when we begin to describe film noir, we are usually describing a certain style. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, to begin with, film noir is a French word meaning black film. It was the French who first discovered these films as such in a critical sense, who began to write about these films, began to analyze these films, and as they saw these certain films, took them as a whole and said, there are certain things in these films that are repeated. So we began to get, iconography and conventions that indicate that this is a kind of film that was being made. It's actually, for the most part, post-war, although some, because of the style, some will say, hey, it goes all the way back even to the silent era. But at any rate, it's the stylistic parts of it. Essentially, it is adaptations of American pulp fiction and hard-boiled novels. It seems to have its basis in what was going on in a literary sense. As it stated, it's right there, pulp magazines, pulp fiction, and the hard-boiled detective novels, the Sam Spade and so forth. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it was discovered and debuted in the sense that it was recognized and began to talk about them in post-war France. So what are we talking about? Well, the first thing that we see with regard to the film noir is the setting. The setting is far from being your country garden. They are urban. It is pretty much, and as many have argued, the city becomes part of the show in the sense it's like a character. It is often has, and in most cases has, rain-slick streets. I can't think of a film noir that doesn't have, is not done where the streets are raining, and streets essentially reflect the light. It's part of that style. And the third point there is the sleazy side of city life. It may not be set in Skid Row, but it's set in an atmosphere, an ambience of the sleaze of the city. It's often set around nightclubs and bars and taverns, you know, in the old days, what they'd call a beer joint. Often the detective himself, that's part of where he lives, is in that part of the city. The themes that are associated with film noir, two of them essentially, and they're related, it's alienation and existentialism. It's the sense that everyone's a loner. It's like everyone is a lonely individual in the middle of a crowd. Associated with that is the philosophy of existentialism, in the sense that nothing exists. There's nothing of any value. Life is a lot of nothingness. You live for a while and you die, and that's it. And it's that kind of world out there. And then the character types that inhabit that kind of world are amnesiacs, antisocial loners, and the primary focus is on the private detective. That's important because it distinguishes what's important about that is that he is not associated in any way with authority. He is a good guy, but often he's a good guy because he's better than everybody else in the movie. These are the private detectives that are hired by somebody to go out and find the goods on people. But they do have their own sense of morality. Often they work for someone who might be a crook, and they end up giving them the money back because they don't want to be associated with them, and they'll do what's right just because it's right. It might not even be that such a detective would feel that himself. That is, it's just the thing I've got to do. Not that I believe in it, but that it's just the thing to do. There is a sense of morality associated with it, with these private detectives. They are loners. All of them are just isolated from everyone else, often because they want to be. And what runs through there often are amnesiacs. And so all three of those things fit perfectly in my favorite film noir, which is called Black Angel. And amnesia plays an essential part in that drama. The main character is an antisocial loner. He is the loneliest man in the crowd, but he's not a private detective. And he essentially goes on his case to find out who murdered his wife. And he links up with this woman whose husband has been accused of murdering his wife, and she wants to get her husband out of jail. It's a complex story, well done by Cornell Woolrich. Okay, we move on to film style. Now, this is essentially our dilemma here. This is what we see in film noir. Low-key lighting, shadowy elements, strange highlights, and extreme camera angles, high and low, distortion, what they call Dutch angles. All of these things are found in the film noir. The same things can be said for Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane uses low-key lighting. Shadowy elements are found everywhere in Citizen Kane. There are strange and odd highlights that you find in Citizen Kane, and there are extreme camera angles, high-low distortion, so forth and so forth. Does that make Citizen Kane a film noir? Some people argue it does. Some people say even the themes are found in Citizen Kane. Others say, no, there's no way it is. So this is the dilemma that the film scholars have, and this is why they make big money on huge campuses, is because they continue to argue back and forth, making the claim that film noir is a genre, and others saying, no, it's not. All right. Also be aware of the production code and film noir. There's one thing about film noir that came in the post-war films is they're precursors of naughty movies. Film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. Adultery runs rampant in themes in this sort of thing in film noir. And, of course, gender issues and film noir, and essentially that key part right there, women as femme fatales. Some have argued that, film noir resulted from Rosie the Riveter. And that is that all the men were gone fighting the war, but somebody had to run the factories, and the only ones left were the women, so the women went and worked in the factories. And then when the men came back from the war, they wanted to get back to the factory, and Rosie the Riveter said, you can forget about coming back here. I like what I'm doing. I want to stay here, and I want to drive those rivets. And so it was the idea that the women were taking control. The women were saying, we're not moving. And the film noir, those movies, began to depict strong-willed women. And you will find in almost every film noir that one of the strongest characters, if not the strongest character, is female. And that's true for Black Angel. It is the hero, the guy who's looking for the murder of his wife, is dominated by the woman who's trying to get her husband out of jail. So it's a very much the film noir is ripe for analysis with regard to gender issues. And in summary then, with regard to film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality. Modern mass American culture, consumerism, and disillusionment with paradise lost. We win the war, but we come back to a country that has changed. A country that will, by a decade later, have a radical change in it. And film noir, perhaps, was just prescient. It could see these changes. Okay, we move into film in the television age. We have a post-war decline in attendance. We have a very interesting thing. The war is over. Everybody comes home, and we have more people in theaters than ever before. Attendance was at its highest. It's never been reached. It has never been surpassed. The following year, it's the lowest. Why? What happened? Well, there are many reasons. One of them, of course, is the threat of television. But TV, as this series points out, TV is not the only culprit. No, there was more leisure time, more money. There were interest in other activities, such as bowling, and there was migration to the suburbs. Agreements between motion picture industry and TV. Essentially, what happened was that TV, which is best at selling stuff, that's about all, TV becomes a subsidiary market for motion pictures. This is best explained and best seen by Disney. Disney saw the marketing appeal, the marketing of his own movies through television. Okay, we also see the movie's response to competition from television and the decline in attendance. And essentially at this point, the major thing that the Hollywood did was innovations with regard to the technical quality of movies, that they went from flat to wide. What they were saying is, you got that little dinky round TV screen at home and black and white. Come to the theaters, come to our wide screen and color movies. So they give us Cinerama, which is the round one. The round, or not round, but it's essentially the peripheral. I was trying to think of that. Peripheral vision, Cinerama. And then you get 3D. 3D when they start throwing things at you. And then they establish CinemaScope, which is essentially that wide screen. That's pretty much what it is. So you should be very familiar with what they talked about, the aspect ratio, the width to height of projected image. The technical modifications for widescreen to TV, since most of us now see these movies on television, and they talk about panning and scanning, letterboxing, safe action area, and so forth. Okay, now we move on to the creative innovations by the independent producers. A movie company called American International Pictures, it sees the teen market, that even though mom and dad are not going to the movies like they used to, the teenagers are going right and left. The teenagers are filling the theaters. And one thing that seems to appeal to them are monsters. And so during the 1950s, we have a plethora of monster movies. Also, the low-budget exploitation films that exploit newspaper headlines. This is the rise of the independent producer. It is also the rise of the box office boffo. That, in other words, that Hollywood movies, the main major studios, are beginning to see that, well, we can't make money like we used to off the low-budget films. We have to make a movie that is a huge, giant spectacle, and in the 1960s, that's when we get roadshow movies and all the big spectacles. Then we move into the film school generation, the two 1960s, a transition in Hollywood. The older movies like Lover Come Back, the older generation, that's what you'd call adult film for that generation, versus the younger generation with a movie like The Graduate. And then in the film school, the generation section, we talk about 1960s counterculture movement, ideological war and generational war and the social political climate. All of that kind of stuff is having an impact on Hollywood. And I'm not going to go through all of these things here, but just roughly there, you know, beware of the exploitation films that deal with sex, drugs, violence, horror, blaxploitation, that short-lived cycle of black action movies. And then, of course, the rating system changes. Censorship is pretty much gone. You get to do it whatever you want to. We'll just put a letter next to it. Call it G, PG, X, whatever. And I'm not going to go through all of that. You can check that out on the study guide. Be familiar with modern filmmakers and examples of their works. These are the people like George Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, etc. And also the filmmakers that are on the fringes, which often have a lot more interesting films to show us, such as Julie Dash. And remember that a movie just ain't a movie anymore. And to bring it to an end, the new media, you know, it's a horizontal control, which is essentially that you have to have all kinds of auxiliary things to go with the movie. And remember your photo ID and all that kind of stuff, that's it. Make sure and get the study guide downloaded off of Moodle, and you'll be in good shape. That's all. See you later. Have a good spring break, I guess.
online. Learn, unlearn, relearn.